The sale closing took 6 months, mostly because of title issues, but partly because the previous owner had died intestate, and the estate was a mess of paperwork. When the keys finally landed in my hand, heavy and brass, they felt less like a victory and more like an obligation. The house wasn't a Victorian Gothic cliché or a dilapidated farmhouse. It was a 1970s split level, clad in cedar siding that had grayed with age, sitting at the end of a gravel driveway that wound 3 miles off the main county road. It was architectural, sharp-angled, and drowning in the surrounding woodland. I bought it for silence. That was the primary selling point. I work in data analysis, a job that requires focus and, more importantly, an absence of the chaotic frequency of the city. I needed a place where the only variables were the ones I introduced. Move-in day was a blur of cardboard and packing tape. I did it alone. I didn't want friends over. I didn't want a performative pizza and beer ritual. I just wanted to unpack my life and slot it into this new grid. By the time I broke down the last box in the living room, the sun was dipping below the tree line. The light in the house changed instantly. It didn't just get dark. The quality of the air seemed to thicken, turning a bruised purple through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The first 3 nights were uneventful, strictly speaking. The house made sounds, but they were the sounds of physics. The plumbing was old copper, and whenever I turned off the hot tap in the kitchen, a dull, rhythmic hammering would travel through the walls, a phenomenon known as water hammer. I noted it. I planned to fix it. It was mechanical. It made sense. The wind would catch the eaves, and the thermal contraction of the wood as the temperature dropped caused a framing to pop. These are the things you tell yourself. You catalog the noises. You label them. You dismiss them. It was Tuesday when the logic started to fail. I have a routine. It is not a compulsion, but a preference for order. When I come to the front door, I lock it. I place my wallet on the corner of the toaster oven. I place my car keys, a remote fob, and 2 brass house keys on a leather loop into a small ceramic bowl on the kitchen island. I do this every single time. It is muscle memory. That afternoon, I came in from a grocery run. I put the bags down. I put the wallet on the toaster. I dropped the keys in the bowl. The clatter of metal on ceramic was distinct. I heard it. I unpacked the groceries, putting the milk and eggs in the refrigerator. The kitchen was bright, illuminated by the recessed lighting I had installed the day before. I went upstairs to wash my face. I was up there for perhaps 10 minutes. The house was locked. I was the only living thing within 3 miles. When I came back down to grab my phone charger from the car, the bowl on the island was empty. I stopped. I didn't feel fear, not yet. I felt a sudden spike of irritation. I assumed I had broken my routine, that I was tired, distracted. I checked my pockets. Empty. I checked the counter next to the bowl. Nothing. I retraced my steps to the car, thinking I'd left them in the ignition. The car was locked. I peered through the window. The ignition was empty. I went back inside. I searched the kitchen floor, thinking they had fallen. I checked the refrigerator, in case I had mindlessly set them on a shelf while putting away the milk. Nothing. For 20 minutes, I tore the downstairs apart. I was questioning my own sanity, my own memory. Finally, I walked into the dining room. I hadn't been in the dining room all day. It was a space I rarely used, furnished only with a long teak table and 6 chairs. The room was bathed in shadows, the curtains drawn. There, precisely in the center of the table, were my keys. I stood in the doorway, staring at them. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Had I walked in here? I had no memory of it. Why would I walk into a dark room and place my keys in the exact geometric center of a table I never used? I walked over and picked them up. They were cold, not just cool to the touch, like metal in an air-conditioned room. They were freezing. It felt as if they had been sitting in a freezer for an hour. The cold stung my fingertips. I dropped them into my pocket, my hand trembling slightly. I told myself it was a draft. I told myself I was sleepwalking while awake. But the skin on the back of my neck was tight, prickling with a biological alarm that predates language. Something was wrong. By the second week, the house began to assert itself. The silence I had paid for was being eroded, not by loud noises, but by the suggestion of presence. It started with the floors. The house had hardwood throughout, oak on the main level, pine upstairs. With squeaks, it expands and contracts. But there is a specific sound a floorboard makes when weight is applied to it. It is a sequence, a compression, a groan, and then when the foot lifts, a release. I would be sitting in the living room, reading on my tablet, the screen the only light in the room, and from directly above me in the guest bedroom, I would hear it. Creak, pause, release. It was the cadence of a step. Slow, deliberate. The first time it happened, I grabbed a flashlight and sprinted upstairs, convinced someone had broken in. I kicked the guest room door open, lights swinging wildly. The room was empty. The window was locked. The dust motes danced in the beam of my light, undisturbed. I stood there listening. The house was dead silent. I decided to test it. I walked into the room, stepping on every board until I found the one that squeaked. It was near the closet. I pressed my weight onto it. Creak. I stepped off. Release. The tone was identical. I went back downstairs. 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Creak. It wasn't wind. Wind doesn't have mass. Wind doesn't shift its weight from one foot to another. The activity escalated, but remained maddeningly subtle. It was a war of attrition. I would leave the bathroom door open at a 90-degree angle to let the humidity out after a shower. When I returned an hour later, it would be clicked shut, not slammed, just closed, the latch engaged. I started leaving the lights on in the hallways. I stopped sleeping with the door open. One Wednesday evening, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The air felt pressurized like the moments before a thunderstorm, though the sky outside was clear. I was in the kitchen and I felt watched. It wasn't a vague feeling. It was a sensation of specific focus, as if eyes were fixed on the back of my head. I decided I needed objective proof. If I was going crazy, I needed to know. If I wasn't, I needed to know that too. I set up my smartphone on the kitchen counter, propped against a stack of cookbooks. I framed the shot so it covered the long hallway leading to the back bedrooms and the bathroom. I hit record. I left the house. I went out to the porch, sat on the steps, and waited. I listened to the crickets, the wind in the pines. I smoked a cigarette, though I had quit years ago. I waited for an hour. I heard nothing from inside. No footsteps. No banging pipes. I went back in, retrieved the phone, and sat on the couch to watch the footage. The first 40 minutes were excruciatingly boring. Just a static shot of an empty hallway. The lighting didn't change. The shadows didn't move. I scrubbed through the timeline, speeding it up. Then at the 46-minute mark, I saw it. In the background of the shot, the bathroom door was visible. It was closed. On the screen, the brass handle began to turn. It didn't jerk. It rotated with agonizing slowness. It took a full 10 seconds for the latch to disengage. I watched, my mouth dry, as the door pushed open. It moved about 3 inches, revealing the darkness of the bathroom tile. Then, the handle released, rotating back to its neutral position. There was no one there. I replayed the video with the volume at maximum. I held the speaker to my ear. Silence. There was no sound of footsteps approaching the door. No sound of feet on the tile. Just a mechanical click of the internal latch sliding back and the soft creak of the hinge. The physics of it were impossible. To turn that knob required grip, friction, and torque. To push the door required force. Something with no mass had manipulated a physical object in my home. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on, watching the hallway. I felt like an intruder in my own home. The house didn't belong to me. I was just occupying space that was already claimed. The climax didn't happen on a dark and stormy night. It happened on a Tuesday at 2:14 in the morning. I had retreated to the master bedroom. It was the only room where I felt remotely safe, mostly because I had installed a heavy-duty deadbolt on the door the day after the video incident. I locked the door. I left the bedside lamp on. I forced myself to close my eyes. I woke up instantly, snapped from deep sleep into total alertness. There was no transition, no grogginess. I was simply awake. The room was quiet. The lamp was still on, casting a warm, yellow glow over the duvet. The shadows of the furniture were long and sharp. I looked at the door. There is a gap beneath the door of the master bedroom, about half an inch between the wood and the carpet. Light from the hallway, where I had left the overhead fixture on, spilled through this gap, creating a bright yellow strip on the bedroom floor. Two shadows broke that strip of light. They were distinct, solid. They were the shadows of 2 feet, standing directly against the door. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, wet thumping that echoed in my ears. I stared at the gap. The shadows were motionless. They weren't shifting. Whoever, whatever, was standing there was perfectly still, listening. I waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes. The silence was absolute. If it had been a burglar, I would have heard breathing, the rustle of clothes, the shift of weight. There was nothing, just the visual evidence of obstruction. I slowly reached for my phone on the nightstand. My hand was shaking so badly, I almost knocked over a glass of water. I gripped the cold metal of the phone, my thumb hovering over the emergency dial. "Who is that?" I called out. My voice sounded pathetic, thin. It cracked on the last word. There was no answer. The shadows didn't move. "I have a gun. I lied. Get away from the door." Still nothing. The feet remained planted. I watched, paralyzed, for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 5 minutes. Then the shadows changed. They didn't walk away. They didn't step back. They simply dissolved. They faded from opaque black to gray, and then to nothing, as if the density of the entity was evaporating. The strip of light under the door returned to being an unbroken yellow line. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. My shoulders slumped, and then the door handle exploded. It wasn't a turn. It was a violent, frantic rattling. The metal knob was being wrenched back and forth with incredible speed and force. Clack, 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 clack. The entire door shuddered in its frame. The deadbolt groaned against the strike plate. It wasn't trying to open the door. It was trying to break it down. I scrambled backward, pushing myself up against the headboard, pulling my knees to my chest. The noise was deafening in the quiet house. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat had seized shut. I just watched that brass knob jerking violently, waiting for the wood to splinter, waiting for the lock to fail. Then instantly it stopped. 1 second, chaos. The next, silence. The sudden absence of noise was worse than the rattling. It left a ringing in my ears. I stared at the door, waiting for the next assault. It didn't come. I stayed in that bed until the sun came up. I didn't look at my phone. I didn't close my eyes. I watched the handle. When the gray light of dawn finally washed out the yellow of the lamp, I forced myself to move. My muscles were stiff, my body aching from tension. I walked to the door. I listened. Nothing. I unlocked the deadbolt. It slid back with a smooth click. I turned the handle and opened the door. The hallway was empty. The morning light filtered into the living room windows, illuminating the dust floating in the air. Everything looked normal. The terror of the night felt like a fever dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. I walked down the hall, intending to leave. I needed coffee. I needed people. I needed to be anywhere but here. As I passed the guest bedroom, I glanced inside. I stopped. I had not entered the guest bedroom in 3 days. I had made the bed perfectly when I moved in. Hospital corners. The duvet smooth flat, the pillows fluffed. It was a pristine surface. Now, in the exact center of the mattress, there was an impression. It was deep and circular. The fabric of the duvet was crushed down, compressing the memory foam underneath. It was the unmistakable shape of someone sitting on the edge of the bed, but it wasn't on the edge. It was in the middle, and next to the depression, resting on the smooth white fabric of the pillow, was a single long indentation, like a head had rested there. I walked into the room. I reached out and touched the center of the depression. The fabric was warm, not room temperature. Warm, as if body heat had been applied to it only seconds ago. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't brush my teeth. I turned around, walked down the stairs, picked up my car keys from a bowl where they sat undisturbed, and walked out the front door. I got in my car and drove. I drove to a motel 2 towns over. I paid cash. I hired a moving company to clear the house. I told them to put everything in storage. I never went back inside. I sold the house 3 months later to a young couple from the city. I didn't tell them. How could I? There was nothing to tell. No murder, no history, no tragedy. Just a house that didn't want to be empty. Sometimes, late at night in my new apartment in the city, surrounded by the comforting roar of traffic and sirens, I wake up at 2:14 a.m. I look at the bedroom door. I wait for the handle to turn, and I pray that the warmth I felt on that bed was just my imagination, because the alternative, that something was sleeping there waiting for me to wake up, is a thought I cannot live with.